Welcome to Discovering. I am on Whitefish Point, and over here is the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. And as you can see, Lake Superior is saying that the gales of November are starting to rush in. This year is the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the most famous and most recent shipwrecks in Great Lakes history. 50 years later, why does the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald fascinate so many people? And how are those 29 lives still honored today here at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum? So join me tonight for a special edition of Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone, forests thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak, surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields, call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill, the eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
November 10th is a date etched in Great Lakes history. And now it has been 50 years since the tragic sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald on Lake Superior. The legend and mystery of the mighty Fitz has fascinated and haunted many. Bruce Lynn is the executive director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum.
The ship in some ways has seemingly never left the headlines. From the various expeditions that were going down to document the ship or try to better understand why it sank. Still a mystery. We don't really know why that ship sank.
The theories and official ruling as to what ultimately brought down the Fitzgerald are greatly debated. We will never know for certain how a ship that large sunk so quickly with no distress call.
And there's so many different aspects of this story now, let alone Gordon Lightfoot writing a song about this ship and about this crew. That song hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1976. And really that song, in a lot of ways, put that story of that ship and crew and that shipwreck into the public consciousness.
Today, 50 years after, the Edmund Fitzgerald is still in the headlines. Videos about the tragic shipwreck flood YouTube, social media, and news sites. Documentaries and books search for answers.
I think last year we counted 30 or 32 books about the Fitzgerald. I can count at least 8 more that have just been written this year about the Fitzgerald. So there's no shortage of fascination behind this story and people wanting to learn more. How did it sink? Why did it sink? Learning more about the crew, learning more about the ship, learning more about the story. And one of my favorite authors, and really the person that got me interested in the Fitzgerald, is Fred Stonehouse. Fred wrote the first book that came out on the Fitzgerald in 1977. It was published. It's simply called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Ask anyone on the street how many Great Lakes shipwrecks they can name, and most can probably only name one.
Fred, I think, put it really well when he said that the Fitzgerald has come to represent shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. That is really well put. I mean, there are over, some statistics tell us 6,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. Some will tell us 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. There's not the same level of interest in those ships that went down. A lot of us have that interest, but by the general public, not necessarily. But the Fitzgerald, as Fred put it, has come to represent those shipwrecks. And it's probably one of the most important facets of this overall story because it helps people to understand about other shipwrecks at the same time, or at least knowing the power of the lakes and the fact that there are other shipwrecks out there as well.
Those of us who live near Superior know the lake's power and fury. It's wrecks like the Fitzgerald that instill a healthy sense of fear and respect for the big lake. The weather can change drastically, and that's exactly what happened on November 10th, 1975. And from that day forward, we know that the gales of November can sink even the mightiest of ships. Before the Fitzgerald ever set sail, it was making headlines.
The Fitzgerald started out life at the Great Lakes Engineering Works down in the Detroit area, River Rouge. June 1958, the ship was launched. A crowd, I've seen numbers that say anywhere from 10,000 to 17,000 people showed up to watch that ship being launched.
The 729-foot Great Lakes freighter was built to be the largest and fastest at the time.
There was a lot of excitement about that ship. A lot of headlines then about this ship.
Some might say the ship was cursed from the beginning.
And some interesting stories came out of the day that it was launched, too, that kind of go into the lore now about this ship. For starters, when Elizabeth Fitzgerald, Mr. Edmund Fitzgerald's wife, when she went to christen the ship, the champagne bottle that she was using to try to christen that vessel didn't break. Took a couple, 2-3 times. But when the ship was launched too, it kind of went sideways and it created the displacement of that water, created a massive wave that rushed to the other side where there were bleachers set up. And that wave kind of crashed into that general area, and it actually startled one gentleman just enough that he had a heart attack and died later that day. If some people wanted to look at superstitious angles, they would say those were not good signs.
For 17 years after that, though, the Fitz carried iron ore from the western shores of Lake Superior to steel mills on the lower lakes in the Detroit and Toledo area. It broke records and was the favorite of ship watchers. On its final voyage, the Fitzgerald was loaded with just over 26,000 pounds of taconite, pellets of processed iron ore, in Superior, Wisconsin on November 9, 1975, and was headed to Zug Island, Detroit.
Beautiful conditions, beautiful sunny weather, unseasonably warm is what a lot of the references in the newspapers. Captain McSorley and his crew, there were 29 total on board the Fitzgerald. Even though the weather was lovely when they left that Duluth Superior area, they knew that there were warnings of gales, which is so normal. Definitely not unusual that time of the year out on Lake Superior. They passed two harbors, Minnesota. The Arthur M. Anderson, another ship, was leaving that port. And they both, in tandem, for the most part, made their way across Lake Superior. As the weather started to get worse, Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald, Captain Bernie Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, they were in radio communications throughout the day and then the night. And they were aware, again, that the conditions were going to get worse, so they made a determination, or the decision, to take a northern route, kind of hugging that Canadian shoreline, get a little bit of protection from that storm. As they were getting closer to the east end of the lake and up into that kind of northeast corner, Slate Islands are up there, they decided at that point to make their turn to head down to Whitefish Bay.
Winds that evening were at a steady 60 to 65 miles per hour, with gusts up to 80 miles per hour, and waves reached 18 to 25 feet.
The storm was getting worse. The radio communications between Captain Cooper on the Anderson and Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald were reflecting on the conditions, but eventually also Captain McSorley mentioning that he was experiencing a little bit of trouble.
The Fitz was getting battered by the storm. At 3:30 that afternoon, Captain McSorley told the Anderson, "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" The Fitzgerald had also lost both radars. The two ships were roughly 10 miles apart, the Fitzgerald in front.
But as they were closing in on Michipicoten Island and then Caribou Island, there's some shoals right in that area. One of the theories is that perhaps the Fitzgerald, and this is something that Captain Cooper on the Anderson and his crew, they noted that the Fitzgerald was a little bit closer to some of the shoals that were in the area of Caribou Island than they would have wanted to have been. Who knows? Maybe something happened in there where the Fitzgerald possibly struck that shoal. It's a good question. We don't really know. But bottom line, they were closing in on Whitefish Bay. But at one point, just about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, roughly 7:10 p.m., November the 10th, 1975, the Fitzgerald was on the radar of the Anderson. They had been in communications. Shortly before that, first mate on board the Anderson had asked Captain Cooper how they were making out with their problems, and or their problem, I think is how he put it, and Captain McSorley said, "We're holding our own." And those were the last words ever heard from the Fitzgerald, because shortly after that, there was a snow squall that came through. It really obscured all visibility. And shortly after that squall passed, the lights of the Fitzgerald were not there anymore. They couldn't pick it up on radar. Where was the Fitzgerald?
When we last had contact with him, the mate had talked to him at about 10 minutes after 7, 1910, and he said he was going along fine and no problems. At what time was the last time that you had any cause or that you noticed that you had the Fitzgerald in front of you, over? The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
It took Captain Cooper of the Anderson 2 calls to the U.S. Coast Guard to get them to take the Fitzgerald's disappearance seriously.
It looks from the information that we have that it's fairly certain that the Fitzgerald went down, and we're talking now about a matter of life and death and looking for survivors that might be in life rafts or in the water, and we can only ask the masters to do the best without hazarding their vessel. The vessel you're searching for is the Edmund Fitzgerald. Well, I'll go back and take a look, but God, I'm afraid that I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there on it. Do you realize what the conditions are out there?
And now the search was on, and at that point, even the Coast Guard individual asked Captain Cooper if he'd be willing to turn his ship around and go out and search in case the Fitzgerald did sink, in case there might have been crewmen on life rafts. Probably not an easy decision for Captain Cooper, but that's exactly what he did. They turned around because he knew if that was them out there, the Fitzgerald would have done the same thing.
The Coast Guard also sent out aircraft to search. There was no ship and no survivors found.
It wasn't long after that that one of the aircraft, I believe with a magnetometer, noted an anomaly on the bottom of the lake, which the following year was positively identified as being the Fitzgerald.
The Edmund Fitzgerald stayed in the headlines as investigators tried to understand what happened, and divers searched the wreckage.
The last expedition to go down, which was a combined Royal Canadian Navy, Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, National Geographic, and Sony Corporation expedition to recover the Belle. That made headlines as well.
On July 4th, 1995, the ship's bell was brought up, and a replica was placed on the remains of the ship.
The backstory was petitioning the Canadian government to allow for this expedition to take place and allow for the Belle to be removed. A lot of the Fitzgerald family members were heavily involved in this. Ruth Hudson, her son Bruce Hudson, was on board. She was instrumental. Cheryl Rosman, her dad, Ransom Cundy, was on board the Fitzgerald when it sank. Janice Armagost, her husband, was on board the Fitzgerald when it sank. Debbie Champeau, her dad, was on the Fitzgerald. He was a third assistant engineer on the ship when it went down. They worked very, very hard on other Fitzgerald family members at the same time to petition the Canadian government to allow for this project, this expedition to go forward, but also to call it a grave site and really put a stop to all of these expeditions that were going down because their loved ones were down there with that ship.
Today, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, located on the shores of Whitefish Bay, is the caretaker of this history and the Fitz's 200-pound bronze bell.
So the idea of what we do here at the Shipwreck Museum and really overall with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society is we are preserving history in general. And that can mean a lot of different things. That can be preserving the history through our staff interacting with the guests coming to the museum and telling them about such things as the Edmund Fitzgerald, helping people to better understand the story of that ship and what happened on November the 10th, and more importantly, the crew of 29. But we also interpret the history of the ships that we discover as an organization. We've been fortunate. We've found 15 shipwrecks in the last 4 years. So really probably one of the most critical parts of what we do is just keeping this history alive.
We don't forget that the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a tragedy, with the captain and crew lost. 29 men who were fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons. Every year on November 10th, the Shipwreck Museum hosts a private memorial service for the family members of the 29 men.
Each year when we do this memorial ceremony, particularly with the Fitzgerald family members, for a lot of them that come back every year, and us, it's almost like a little family reunion of sorts. We look forward to seeing them coming back each year.
Wayne H. Wilhelm, oiler.
The bell is rung 30 times, once for each of the crew, the 30th for all mariners lost on the Great Lakes. It's estimated 30,000 lives have been lost.
So 50 years from now, will people still be talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald? That's a very good question. It's really hard to tell, but if I had to take a guess, I would say yes. Because as an example, at our memorial services we have, especially each year, we see grandchildren, we see great-grandchildren coming to remember that lost ancestor that they had on the Fitzgerald. So I think the family members of the Fitzgerald, in all likelihood, 50 years from now, they're still going to be talking about the Fitzgerald.
The Michigan gun deer season opens this Saturday, and to get everyone fired up about opening day, here are some big bucks of yesteryear from Iron County. Also, mark your calendar for Buckfest on Saturday, November 22nd from 4 to 7 p.m. in Crystal Falls. Thank you to Steve Lenhart of Superior Sport and Feed of Crystal Falls for sharing these photos with me. That's all for tonight, and I hope to see you right back here next week for Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.